The reason you are so tired is not your work. It is that you spend every day quietly judging everyone around you, measuring them against the discipline you keep, finding them less than, and the verdicts are eating you alive. You do not call it that. You call it having standards, not suffering fools, being a serious man, but it is contempt, and it is the most exhausting work you do all day. The co-worker who does not push himself, the brother who has not gotten his life together, the man at church who does not seem to take any of it seriously, the people in line ahead of you who do not look like they have tried as hard as you have. 1,000 small verdicts a day, none of them spoken, all of them felt, and the issuing of the verdicts is what is tightening your jaw, clenching your chest, and draining the energy you have been blaming on work. You have called this contempt by other names for years, and you have called it strength. But it is not strength. It is fear wearing a costume, and it is destroying you. Disciplined men have a particular kind of disease, and almost no one diagnoses it, because the disease looks, from the outside, like virtue. The disease is that the man who has spent 20 years becoming better than he was has, almost without noticing, begun to need other people to be worse, because the comparison is the only place his progress can be felt. If you have arrived somewhere, someone has to not have arrived. Otherwise, the arrival has no meaning. And so the disciplined man, in some hidden part of himself, develops an interest in the failures of others, a quiet satisfaction when the undisciplined man fails, a sour discomfort when the undisciplined man succeeds, an inability to celebrate with full generosity anyone whose life has been less effortful than his own. You will deny this. If you are a disciplined man hearing it for the first time, I am asking you not to deny it. Yet, I am asking you to sit with the suggestion for 1 minute and to recall, honestly, a moment in the last week when you felt a small private pleasure at someone else's struggle, or a small private resentment at someone else's ease, a moment so small that you immediately rationalized it away, but which was there, however briefly, real and ugly in your chest. That moment was not an aberration. It was the engine of your discipline showing itself, for one unguarded second, before you covered it back up with the language of standards and excellence and high expectations. The man who has built his identity on being more disciplined than others needs. There to be others who are less disciplined, needs it the way a building needs a foundation. And so he scans the world constantly for the inferior, and finds them everywhere, and quietly congratulates himself on not being among them, and calls this congratulation by various respectable names. But it is the same thing every time. It is contempt, and it is destroying him from the inside in ways he does not yet understand. There is a strange finding in the research on what is called moral licensing. The finding, repeated across dozens of studies, is this: people who have just done something virtuous become, in the immediate aftermath, more likely to do something unkind. Not less likely, more likely. The man who has just kept his discipline becomes more likely in the next hour to be sharp with his wife, dismissive of a colleague, impatient with a child. The very act of being good gives him, in his own internal accounting, permission to be small. This is not an exotic finding. You can observe it in yourself if you watch closely. The disciplined morning becomes the irritable afternoon. The kept commitment becomes the cold response to someone else's failure. The spiritual discipline becomes, paradoxically, the source of subtle pride that poisons everything that follows. And underneath this finding is something even darker, that the man who is most invested in his own virtue is the man most likely to wound others without noticing, because his investment in being good has used up something in him, has consumed an emotional resource that would have been available if he were not so busy being virtuous, for the simple work of being kind. This is the empirical mirror of what every spiritual tradition older than 3 centuries, already knew that disciplined men become cold men, that virtuous men become hard men, that the project of self-improvement, pursued without the right corrective, produces not saints, but Pharisees. Psychology can document this. It can show you the pattern. It can even, in some therapeutic contexts, help you begin to notice it in yourself. But psychology cannot tell you why this happens. It can describe the depletion, but it cannot explain why the man who has been climbing toward goodness arrives, so often, at hardness. And it cannot tell you what to do about it, because the cure for hardness is something psychology was never designed to deliver. For that, we have to go to a man who saw this with terrifying clarity 600 years ago. Thomas à Kempis was a monk in the Netherlands in the 15th century. He wrote a small book called The Imitation of Christ, and that small book has, for 600 years, been the most widely read Christian devotional text outside of the Bible itself. Not because Thomas was a brilliant theologian, he was not, but because he understood, with a precision almost no one has matched, what spiritual disciplines do to the man who practices them without humility. Thomas observed that the danger of religious discipline is not that it fails to make you better. Very often it succeeds at making you better by every observable measure. The danger is what it does to your view of other people in the process. He wrote a sentence that should haunt every disciplined man until he can hear what it actually says. The more humble a man is in himself, and the more obedient toward God, the more wise and the more at peace he will be in all that he does. But the proud man, even if he understands many holy things and performs the practices of religion, never finds true peace because he secretly relies on himself. Read that slowly. Thomas is describing a man who performs the practices of religion, who keeps the disciplines, who does everything the spiritual life appears to demand, and who is, beneath that performance, proud, relying on himself. And therefore, Thomas says, never at peace. The disciplined man without humility is not at peace, cannot be at peace, because his discipline is sustaining a self that is, beneath the surface, terrified of being like the people he despises. There is a contemporary writer, a Dutch Catholic priest named Henri Nouwen, who spent his life studying the wound at the center of every minister, every helper, every disciplined and well-meaning person. And Nouwen observed that the person most invested in helping others is often the person most secretly contemptuous of those he helps, because the help is, in part, a way of distancing himself from his own fear of being weak. The disciplined helper, Nouwen said, often becomes the wounded judge. The contempt the disciplined man feels for the undisciplined is, in this reading, not a moral failing he has fallen into. It is the natural fruit of a spiritual life organized around proving he is not what he is most afraid of being. It is the bitter harvest of disciplines pursued for the wrong reasons, and no amount of more discipline will cure it, because more discipline is what produced it. Philosophy and theology can take you this far. They can name the pattern, they can show you the shape of the disease, but they cannot heal it. For that, we have to go to something more radical than insight, something that addresses not the symptom, but the engine that produces it. In the 2nd chapter of his letter to the Romans, Paul says something that should reorganize how you understand your own discipline. He writes to people who consider themselves virtuous, people who keep the law, people who, by every observable measure, are doing the right things. And he says, you who judge others, do you not realize that you do the same things? Paul is making a claim that cuts deeper than it appears on the surface. He is saying that the man who judges another for a failure is almost always, in some hidden form, guilty of the same thing. That the contempt the disciplined man feels for the undisciplined is the contempt he is secretly afraid he deserves himself. That the harshness with which he treats other people's weakness is the harshness he uses to keep his own weakness from emerging. This is what the gospel sees that no other tradition quite sees with the same clarity. The disciplined man's contempt for others is not contempt for them. It is fear of himself, fear that the weakness he sees in them is also in him. Fear that if he ever stopped policing himself with such ferocity, he would discover he is exactly the same. And the discipline is a wall, and the contempt is part of the wall. And the wall is not protecting him from the undisciplined people he despises. It is protecting him from a reckoning with his own humanity. Gospel offers something the disciplined man cannot generate for himself. It offers a reckoning that he does not have to fear, because in Christ, the verdict on the man you are most afraid of being has already been given. And it is not the verdict you have been bracing for. The gospel does not say you have been hiding correctly. Keep hiding. The gospel says you have been hiding from the very thing that would have set you free. That the weakness you have been outrunning for 20 years is the same weakness Christ entered the world to embrace. That the failure you fear is the failure Christ took into himself and made bearable. The disciplined man who can finally hear this and let it land is the man who can finally stop despising others, because he no longer needs to be different from them in order to be acceptable. His acceptability is no longer a function of his distance from their weakness. It is a function of a love that does not depend on his strength. And from that ground, something almost impossible begins to happen. He begins to see the undisciplined people in his life, not as failed versions of himself, not as cautionary tales, not as the inferior backdrop against which his own progress can be measured, but as fellow human beings carrying their own weight, worthy of the same compassion he is finally allowing himself to receive. Contempt does not survive that recognition because the contempt was never about them. It was about his own unaccepted weakness. And once the weakness has been accepted by the only one whose acceptance settles the question, the contempt has nothing left to feed on, and it begins slowly to die. So what do you do with this? Starting today, here is the practice. And it is uncomfortable, because it requires you to look at something you have been carefully not looking at. This week, when you catch the small flicker of contempt for someone, the eye roll at the colleague, the impatience with the family member who is struggling, the cold satisfaction when someone undisciplined fails, the irritation at someone whose life looks easier than yours. Do one thing. Say to yourself silently, "That is the part of me I am most afraid of." That is all. That is the part of me I am most afraid of. You will resist this sentence. You will want to argue with it. You will want to insist that the person you despise is actually different from you in significant ways. And they may be insignificant ways. But the contempt you feel is not about those ways. The contempt is about something inside you, that you have been outrunning for so long that you have forgotten you are running. Each time you say the sentence, you do not have to do anything else. You do not have to forgive the person. You do not have to like them. You do not even have to soften toward them in any visible way. You simply have to admit, in private, that the energy of your contempt is coming from a place inside you that needs to be met. Not by more discipline, but by the same mercy you have been refusing to receive. Over weeks of doing this, the contempt will begin to lose its grip. Not because you have disciplined yourself out of it. That would just be more of the same disease. But because you will have begun to recognize the contempt as a signal, pointing not at the failures of others, but at the unmet weakness inside yourself. And the weakness, once it is met by mercy, no longer needs to be defended against by contempt. You are not going to become a kinder man tomorrow. But each time you catch the contempt and name it for what it actually is, you put one more stone on the long road that leads away from the Pharisee. You have been quietly becoming, and toward the man who can finally stop looking down on others, because he has finally been able to look honestly at himself and found there not the verdict he was bracing for, but a mercy he did not know how to receive.